I was 29 when I realized how completely invisible a person could become. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, but truly unseen, like a stain people learn to step around without noticing. 3 months earlier, I had been sleeping behind a closed diner on the south side of Chicago, wrapped in a torn garbage bag, counting my breaths so the cold would not scare me into panic. Rain soaked through cardboard, through plastic, through every lie I told myself about things getting better. My name back then was Emily Ward, and I said it silently like a prayer, afraid that if I stopped repeating it, even I would forget who I was. I had once believed in structure. Education led to work led to stability, love led to safety. I did everything right, or so I thought, and still ended up measuring nights by how long my fingers stayed numb before pain set in. When people talk about homelessness, they imagine noise and chaos, but the truth is quieter than that. It is hunger with manners, shame that sits politely in your chest. It is learning how to disappear on command. The night everything changed, I was too tired to be afraid anymore. Snow dusted the sidewalk like ash. My shoes were soaked, my socks stiff, and my hands shook as I pushed open the door of a shelter I had passed 100 times and never entered. I expected the usual questions, the usual looks, the quick judgment disguised as procedure. I just wanted soup, a chair, maybe a corner to sleep in without fear. The intake desk was old, scratched, and lit by a flickering bulb. The woman behind it looked ordinary in the way people who hold power over your survival often do. She asked my name, my date of birth, and slid my identification across the counter without meeting my eyes. When she finally looked down at the card, something in her posture changed. Her fingers stopped moving. Her breathing slowed, then stuttered. She looked up at me again, really looked, as if my face were a photograph she had memorized long ago. Then she stood, quietly locked the front door, and pulled the blinds closed one by one. The room dimmed. Conversations behind me faded. My stomach tightened as she leaned closer and spoke so softly it barely sounded real. "We've been searching for you for 15 years. If you want the full truth, hit like so this story reaches more people." For a moment I thought exhaustion had finally cracked something in my brain. People don't search for women like me. They avoid us. They step around us. I laughed, a short broken sound, and told her she had the wrong person. She didn't smile back. Her eyes stayed fixed on mine, sharp and unsettled, like she was afraid I might vanish if she blinked. She asked me to sit. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it carried an authority I hadn't heard directed at me in a long time. As I lowered myself into the plastic chair, memories I had buried began to stir, not clearly, but like shadows pressing against frosted glass. She asked if I remembered a hospital. I shook my head. She asked if I remembered being taken somewhere suddenly as a child, being told not to use my real name. I told her I grew up in Portland, that my parents were teachers, that my childhood was ordinary. Even as I said it, the words felt rehearsed, like lines I had repeated so often they stopped belonging to me. She slid a thin folder onto the desk but didn't open it yet. Instead, she studied my face the way doctors do before delivering news they know will split a life clean in two. I noticed her hands were trembling. That frightened me more than anything she could have said. People with answers don't usually shake. She told me that 15 years ago, a girl with my face, my birthday, and a mark on her left shoulder had disappeared from a state-protected placement program. Officially, the file said the child was deceased. Unofficially, the file had never been closed. I pulled my coat tighter around myself without realizing it, suddenly aware of the familiar crescent-shaped mark hidden beneath the fabric. I had always been told it was nothing, just a birthmark, just skin. She asked if anyone had ever told me I was adopted. I said no. She asked if anyone had ever warned me not to dig too deeply into my past. The answer came slower that time. Yes. My mother had said it jokingly, smiling too wide, changing the subject whenever I asked about the first years of my life. I had never questioned it. You don't question the people who feed you, clothe you, keep you safe, or who you think do. The woman finally opened the folder. Inside was a photograph so old the edges had yellowed. A little girl stared back at me, eyes too serious for her age, the same mark visible on her shoulder. I felt something in my chest give way. It wasn't fear yet. It was recognition, sharp and intimate, like seeing your own handwriting in a place you swear you've never been. She told me my name hadn't always been Emily, that the life I remembered had been built carefully, deliberately, to protect me from something powerful enough to wait 15 years without giving up. I wanted to stand, to leave, to tell her she was wrong, but my legs refused to listen. Comment justice if you believe she deserved justice. She said the people who created my new life believed secrecy was mercy. They believed that if I never knew what I was, I could never be taken for it. I asked her what I was, and for the first time she hesitated. That hesitation told me more than any document could. She wasn't deciding whether to lie. She was deciding how much truth a person could survive in one sitting. She told me about a small private research initiative that operated under government silence, the kind that doesn't show up in history books but leaves fingerprints on real lives. 15 years ago, they had been studying children with unusual biological resilience, children whose bodies adapted faster than expected, healed faster, survived things they shouldn't have. Most of those children never made it past early trials. One of them disappeared. She said the night I vanished, there had been a fire, then sealed records, then silence. Someone had moved me across state lines and placed me with a family who would never ask questions, who would never let anyone else ask them either. I listened as if she were talking about someone else, some stranger who shared my face. But the longer she spoke, the more the gaps in my memory began lining up like cracks in a frozen lake. I remembered being sick less often than other kids, scrapes that closed too fast, fevers that never lasted. I remembered doctors exchanging glances. I remembered being told I was lucky. I had believed them. Luck was easier than truth. My hands were shaking now, not from cold but from something deeper, something unraveling. I asked her why anyone would still be looking for me after all this time. She closed the folder slowly and said that the kind of people who invest in bodies instead of futures don't forget their assets, especially not the ones that worked. That word made me nauseous. Asset. As if I were a building, a patent, a resource waiting to be reclaimed. I thought of the life I had lost, the job that disappeared, the marriage that collapsed under betrayals I still didn't fully understand. I thought about how easily everything had been taken from me, how systematically my support had been stripped away until I had nowhere left to stand. That was when it hit me that my downfall hadn't been random. It had been preparation. Type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once. I asked her who was behind it now. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked me a question that chilled me more than the snow ever had. She asked me if anyone in my life had recently pushed me toward isolation, toward silence, toward losing credibility. I didn't need to think long before a name surfaced, heavy and unavoidable. I said his name out loud and felt the room tilt. My husband, the man who had once promised to catch me if I ever fell, the one who had watched me lose my job, my apartment, my friends, and told me it was just bad luck piling up. The one who suggested, gently at first, then insistently, that maybe I needed space, time, distance from everyone who knew me. The one who never looked surprised when things went wrong. The shelter worker didn't look shocked. That confirmation hurt more than denial ever could have. She told me the people searching for me preferred patience to force. They didn't snatch. They destabilized. They waited for a person to become small enough, desperate enough, isolated enough to be taken without resistance. No one questions what happens to a woman with no home and no witnesses. I asked her if he knew what I was. She said maybe not at first, but someone had realized. Someone had connected dots that were never meant to be seen together. My rapid recovery from illnesses, medical records quietly flagged, insurance data sold and resold. Curiosity grows faster than conscience in certain circles. My chest tightened as memories rearranged themselves. The way my husband's father watched me at family dinners, asking strange questions about my health. The way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. The way my mistakes were amplified while his were quietly erased. None of it felt coincidental anymore. The worker told me there were people on their way. Some wanted to protect me. Others wanted to finish what had been started 15 years ago. She said I had very little time to decide who I trusted. Before I could ask how long I had, headlights washed across the blinds. Engines idled outside, too smooth, too coordinated to be coincidence. My pulse roared in my ears. I asked her what she would do if she were me. She looked tired suddenly, older than her face suggested. She said she would stop running, not by standing still, but by choosing direction. She pressed a small card into my hand with an address and told me that if anyone asked, I had never been there. Then she unlocked a side door and told me to go. As I stepped into the cold night, I understood something I hadn't before. Everything I had lost wasn't just damage, it was clearing. They hadn't destroyed me by accident. They had made room. Share this video so communities understand what was hiding. I walked for hours without feeling my feet, the city stretching and thinning until streets lost their names and buildings sank into shadow. Every sound felt amplified. A car door slamming 2 blocks away made my shoulders tense. A laugh drifting from an open window felt like it belonged to a different species. I kept expecting hands on my arms, a voice telling me to stop. Nothing came. That scared me more than pursuit would have. At dawn, I reached the address on the card. It was an old brick building with boarded windows and a side entrance that looked like it had been forgotten on purpose. I knocked once, then again, and waited. When the door opened, a man with tired eyes and a posture trained by caution stepped aside and waved me in without asking my name. The hallway smelled of dust and disinfectant. Safe, but not welcoming. Temporary by design. Inside, they cleaned the cut on my arm I hadn't noticed bleeding until it soaked my sleeve. The medic frowned at how quickly the skin pulled together and said nothing. I said nothing too. Silence had become a survival skill. They told me I could disappear. New name, new city, a clean slate with no past to chase me. I asked what would happen if I didn't. The man with the tired eyes told me the truth without dressing it up. If I ran, they would keep looking. If I stayed quiet, someone else would be hurt in the process. People like me weren't meant to exist without a price attached. Someone would always want to collect. I thought about the shelter workers' hands shaking. About the way my husband smiled when I apologized for things I didn't understand. About how easily my life had been dismantled piece by piece. I realized then that hiding hadn't saved me. It had only delayed the moment. I asked what staying would mean. They said it would mean learning how deep the betrayal went. It would mean watching people I loved turn into evidence. It would mean becoming invisible on purpose, then stepping back into the light only when it mattered. It would mean losing the last fragments of the person I had been pretending to be. That night I didn't sleep. I lay on a narrow cot staring at the ceiling, listening to pipes hum and footsteps pass. For the first time since I lost everything, fear wasn't the loudest thing in my chest. Clarity was, the kind that settles after the storm when you finally see the shape of the damage. By morning, I knew what I was going to do. They changed my name first. Not ceremonially, not dramatically, just a document slid across a metal table and a pen placed beside it. The name they gave me sounded ordinary enough to dissolve into crowds, the kind of name no one remembers twice. I practiced signing it until my old signature felt like someone else's handwriting. They erased me with efficiency, not cruelty. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected. Over the next weeks, I learned how my life had been dismantled so cleanly. My termination hadn't started with my performance. It had started with a quiet phone call, then a suggestion, then a fabricated concern that spread faster than the truth ever could. My marriage hadn't collapsed from betrayal alone. It had been pressured, nudged, incentivized. My husband hadn't just chosen another woman or another future. He had chosen safety, money, and approval from a man who measured loyalty and returns. Seeing the records hurt more than losing everything the first time. Dates, payments, internal emails written about me as if I were already gone. Plans laid while I was still cooking dinners, still believing apologies, still trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. I wasn't a victim of bad luck. I was a variable that had been controlled. They trained me carefully. Not to fight, not to disappear, but to observe. To listen without reacting. To let people underestimate me because they always did when they thought a woman was broken. Especially one who had already lost everything once. They taught me how to walk into rooms without leaving impressions, how to ask questions that sounded harmless, how to wait. Months later, when I finally saw my husband again, he didn't recognize me. I stood 10 feet away while he laughed, confident and relaxed in a world built on lies. Watching him felt strange, like looking at a photograph of a fire after it had burned itself out. I expected rage. What I felt instead was distance. By then, I understood something essential. Revenge doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins with patience, with letting people believe they've won, with allowing them to relax into their cruelty until they expose everything you need. If this shocked you, comment truth below. I moved through his world slowly, carefully, like a guest who knew better than to touch anything. Meetings, events, casual conversations that pretended to be nothing more than professional overlap. He spoke freely around me, complained about pressure, about expectations, about how some people just weren't strong enough to handle the truth. Each time he said it, I wondered if a part of him knew he was talking about me, even if his mind hadn't caught up yet. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. The research wasn't about healing anymore. It was about ownership, about creating something rare and then deciding who deserved access to it. Lives reduced to projections. Bodies turned into forecasts. The language was clean, polite, stripped of anything that might resemble guilt. That was how they survived themselves. There was a night I almost stopped. I stood alone in a quiet office, city lights blinking below, and felt the weight of everything pressing in at once. The woman I used to be would have called it enough. She would have walked away, chosen peace over justice, chosen anonymity over consequence. I stood there for a long time, hands resting on cold glass, and mourned her properly for the first time. Then I remembered the shelter, the locked door, the words spoken in a whisper that had cracked my life open. I remembered how easy it had been to erase me when I was no longer useful, how fast everyone had looked away. That memory steadied me. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about balance. When the evidence was finally complete, it felt almost anticlimactic. Files copied, trails mapped, signatures confirmed. Years of waiting reduced to a folder that could fit under one arm. I handed it over without ceremony. The people who took it understood the weight of what they were holding. They didn't congratulate me. They didn't thank me. They simply nodded, and that was enough. The fallout came fast. Raids, arrests, names I had heard spoken with reverence suddenly spoken with disbelief. My husband's face on the news looked smaller than I remembered, his confidence collapsing into something thin and frightened. I watched without satisfaction and without regret. Justice doesn't always feel loud when it arrives. Sometimes it feels quiet, like a room finally empty. After everything broke, the world kept moving with an indifference that surprised me. Trains still ran on time. Coffee shops still opened their doors. People complained about weather and deadlines as if nothing monumental had shifted beneath their feet. I realized then that justice rarely announces itself to everyone. It whispers to the people who need to hear it and lets the rest continue as they were. They offered me another disappearance. A quieter one this time. No pursuit, no shadows, just distance. I considered it seriously. There was comfort in the idea of never being recognized again, of never having to explain what I had survived. But comfort had already cost me too much once. I wasn't interested in safety that required silence. I returned to the shelter weeks later, not as a resident but as a visitor. The same intake desk, the same flickering light. The woman who had locked the door for me looked up and froze again, this time with relief instead of fear. We didn't hug. We didn't say much. Some moments don't need language. I left an envelope on the counter before I went. Enough to keep the doors open longer. Enough to make sure the next invisible person had a place to land. As I stepped back into the street, I caught my reflection in a dark window. I barely recognized myself, and for once that didn't feel like loss. It felt like space. I understood now that my life had been split into before and after not by betrayal, but by awakening. By the moment I stopped asking why this happened to me and started asking what I was going to do with what remained. I don't believe pain makes people stronger by default. I think pain reveals what was already there, waiting. Mine had revealed patience, clarity, and a refusal to be erased quietly ever again. I didn't need revenge anymore. I had something better. Choice. Final decisions are rarely dramatic. Mine came on an ordinary morning, with ordinary light pouring through a window. I chose to stay involved, but not visible. To help dismantle quietly rather than burn loudly. to make sure what happened to me couldn't be repeated without resistance. Somewhere in the city, people still walk past shelters without looking in. Somewhere, someone still believes stability is permanent. I know better now. And because I know better, I pay attention. Years have passed since that night, but time hasn't softened it. If anything, it sharpened the edges, carved meaning into moments I once thought were meaningless. I learned how systems protect themselves, how easily truth is buried under paperwork and polite language. I learned that evil rarely looks like rage. More often it looks like confidence, like men who smile while signing documents that will ruin lives they never have to see. I moved cities when necessary, never long enough to grow roots that could be pulled up again. I worked quietly with people who believed information was more powerful than force. We followed patterns, traced money, watched how influence moved when no one thought they were being watched. Every case reminded me that my story was not unique, only unusually visible because I survived long enough to understand it. Sometimes I thought about my husband, about whether he ever truly loved me or whether love had simply been another role he played well. I stopped trying to answer that question. Some truths don't offer closure. They only offer distance. And distance, I learned, can be enough. What stayed with me most was the memory of who I had been when I first walked into that shelter. Cold, ashamed, convinced I had failed at life. I wish I could tell her what I know now. That collapse is not the same as defeat. That losing everything can be a beginning if you're still breathing at the end of it. That invisibility can be a weapon if you learn how to use it. I still walk past shelters sometimes, still listen to the sound of people trying to survive another night. I don't see weakness there anymore. I see endurance. I see stories no one has bothered to ask for. And every time I remember the door locking behind me and the words that followed, I understand that my life didn't change because someone found me. It changed because I finally saw myself clearly. If you've ever felt erased, ever felt like your life collapsed without explanation, remember this. Someone benefits from that collapse, and someone else is waiting for you to stand back up. I don't tell my story often, not because it hurts too much, but because stories like mine make people uncomfortable. They prefer clean endings, villains who look obvious, heroes who never break. Real life isn't built that way. Real life is quiet until it is. It's a series of small permissions given to the wrong people, until suddenly everything collapses at once. What I've learned is this. Most people don't lose their lives in one dramatic moment. They lose them slowly. A job here, a reputation there, a relationship that turns conditional, support that becomes silence. By the time they realize what's happening, they're already being described as unreliable, unstable, forgettable. That's the danger. Not the fall, but how easily the world explains it away. I carry that awareness with me now. It shapes how I listen, how I watch, how I intervene when I can. I've stepped in more times than I can count, quietly redirecting pressure, flagging patterns before someone else disappears into them. No one thanks me. No one needs to. Prevention doesn't look like heroism. It looks like absence, like a crisis that never makes the news. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the question that started everything. Who was I really before they took everything? The answer isn't simple. I was naive. I was trusting. I was ordinary. But I was also resilient in ways I didn't yet understand. That resilience didn't come from what they did to me. It came from what I chose not to become afterward. I didn't become bitter. I didn't become cruel. I didn't become the thing they wanted to own. I became attentive, deliberate, unavailable to manipulation. Those qualities don't look impressive from the outside, but they change outcomes in ways force never could. If there's one truth I hold on to, it's this. Being found isn't about someone else recognizing you. It's about the moment you recognize yourself as worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth rebuilding without permission. The night I finally allowed myself to rest, really rest, I understood that survival is not the opposite of loss. It is the response to it. Everything I had been stripped of had taught me how fragile certainty is and how dangerous comfort can become when we mistake it for safety. I no longer measure my life by what I own, where I belong, or how easily my name is spoken. I measure it by awareness, by the ability to see manipulation before it tightens, by the courage to choose action instead of silence. People still ask whether it was worth it, losing a marriage, a career, a name. They want a clean equation where suffering equals reward. Life doesn't work that way. What I gained was not compensation. It was clarity. And clarity changes how you move through the world. It makes you harder to deceive and impossible to quietly erase. Sometimes I imagine an alternate version of myself, one who never walked into that shelter, who kept running until there was nothing left to run from. That version doesn't survive. Not because she was weak, but because she never learned the truth in time. Truth is not gentle. It doesn't arrive with comfort. It arrives with disruption, with doors closing, with sentences that rearrange your entire history in a single breath. I was homeless at 29. I was invisible. I was hunted without knowing it. And I survived long enough to understand why. That understanding became my anchor. Not revenge, not anger, understanding. If this story stayed with you, if it made you question how easily lives can be dismantled and rewritten, then do one thing for me. Like this video so stories like this reach the people who think they are alone. Comment below and tell me, do you believe truth always finds a way out, even when it's buried for years? And subscribe, because there are more stories like this, stories that remind us awareness is the first form of power.